How's everyone doing today? Welcome back into the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, and on today's show, on top of two stories I wanted to talk about, I wanted to bring up a couple of what-if scenarios, a couple of situations that if they went in one direction, it could have changed my whole viewpoint on it and could have ended up very differently around the NFL and just how people envision it nowadays. So, on top of those two what if scenarios to start the show, on today's episode live on May the 2nd, we're going to be talking about how the Las Vegas Raiders ended up with one of the most talented guys in the draft, Brock Bowers, falling to them at 13. I'm going to react to that and just sort of how all of it broke down on draft day. Then, to close out the show, Steelers general manager Omar Khan addressed the trade rumors around Brandon Ayuk, Courtland Sutton, Deebo Samuel. He talked about it all on the Pat McAfee show, and I'm going to come on here and discuss it and see which outcome seems more likely for the Pittsburgh Steelers once the NFL season starts in later this year in a few months. So all of that is coming up on today's episode. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. And as always, before I start on the first segment, a reminder to you guys, if you have any questions or comments during today's live show, to use the tip and donations link you see on your screen, GSMCPodcast.net. Using this link, I'm able to see your question in my chat box. I can read it on air and get your guys' perspective on anything I say or on either of the topics on today's show. It's a lot more interactive and it's a massive help for the show as well as all the other shows across the network. So if you guys would, with any of your questions or comments, use the tip and donations link, GSMCPodcast.net. Saying that, the first topic on today's show, one of the what-if scenarios, all starts from this report that recently came out from the Atlanta Falcons and them trying to trade back into the first round after their very surprising selection of Michael Penix. Of course, if, like most people, you watched the draft, you saw at pick number 8, the Atlanta Falcons surprised everybody and threw everyone's draft plan out the window by selecting Michael Penix. Of course, they signed Kirk Cousins to that massive deal, $180 million, $100 million guaranteed. So to take a quarterback here didn't make too much sense for me. And my mindset on this, before this report came out, was that this was the Atlanta Falcons' initial plan going into the draft, thinking that they're going to get a quarterback and forget about the defense. We'll address that later. I didn't think that was the right mindset to attack this draft with, but now with this report coming out, it sort of swayed me and a little bit, kind of holding off on my feelings around drafting a quarterback because I was really against it, but now I can sort of understand where they're coming from. To talk more about the report in specifics, it was reported by Steve Wyche of the NFL Network that Atlanta was actually targeting UCLA pass rusher Laiatu Latu, targeting him in the middle part of the draft, actually around where he went at 15. The first defensive player selected, right about the midpoint of the first round. That's the area where the Atlanta Falcons were targeting to trade back into the first round. And you look at that, you consider all your options. The teams in and around there, the Seahawks, the Colts who selected Laiatu Latu, and at 14 you had the New Orleans Saints, all viable options to trade with. I guess not the Saints, same division. That, thinking about it now, wouldn't be too likely. But you had the Colts who ended up drafting Laiatu Latu, and knowing Chris Ballard and the kind of general manager that he is, he really values the picks, accumulating them, kind of preparing for future drafts, having that ammunition in his back pocket to work with, maybe make deals with later on. He is one of the most notorious GMs for gathering draft picks, and that seems like a very reasonable opportunity for them to trade up with. But ultimately, it didn't end up working out for the Falcons. They only had that one pick in the first round, being Michael Penix, and with that, I like the idea now that I'm seeing it. The reports are coming in They reportedly were going to offer a few of their day 2 picks. They had two third round picks available in that second day of the draft. They could have offered their second round pick as well. But again, nothing was really confirmed as to what specifically they offered or what maybe the Colts rejected or any of those other teams. But it was reasonable for them to trade back to target that defensive player in the end. And what's even more fascinating to me around the Falcons and them trying to trade back into the first round, there was also some interest with the New York Jets at number 10 from the Atlanta Falcons. If you guys are aware, the New York Jets had a draft documentary on YouTube called Flight 24, and it's their NFL draft documentary, like I mentioned. And on there, I've seen a few clips from this documentary. I haven't actually watched the whole thing, but I've seen a few clips of just relating to the draft and the Jets in relation to their discussions and how sort of everything breaks down with them trying to trade and make these decisions. One of them I saw was completely different from this situation when they were trying to trade up to draft Malachi Corley in the later rounds, actually considering Roman Wilson, who ended up going to the Steelers, and how all of that broke down, them reaching out to a few teams, getting a lot of no's back, but then finally the Carolina Panthers deciding to trade up with them. It's pretty interesting seeing those conversations that, on draft night, if you're watching ESPN, ABC, whatever you watch the draft through, to see this documentary and not only look at them in their draft room and seeing their reactions, dapping each other up, celebrating. You could actually hear them in the documentary and how it all goes down, which I thought was super interesting. And in those conversations, you can see, because they have the subtitles on these clips going around the internet, that there's a moment in there where General Manager Joe Douglas gets off the phone with the Atlanta Falcons, apparently, and his quote from that moment was, they want to come back up to 10, so they want number 8 and number 10, is what General Manager Joe Douglas said, obviously referring to the Atlanta Falcons. And that is even more fascinating to me because you saw that number 10 pick. It was originally traded over to the Minnesota Vikings. I was drawing a blank there for a second, but the Vikings moved up there because, ironically, of the move that the Atlanta Falcons made. And this is where the whole what-if scenario kind of comes into mind. What if the Atlanta Falcons, instead of going quarterback first, instead of really pushing all their chips onto Michael Penix and anticipating that he becomes their long-term quarterback after Kirk, having one of the most luxurious insurance policies there at the quarterback position, what if instead of going quarterback at number 8, they went defensive player first, and then they tried to trade back into the first round for a quarterback? I think this would have all flipped on its head if they decided to go that route. If they decided to go according to the plan, you see all these mock drafts and everybody projecting their picks. Everybody had a defensive player penciled in for the Atlanta Falcons, at number 8. That was the plan. That was the anticipation. And I think if it broke down that way, you wouldn't have seen this whole chain reaction of the Vikings, the Broncos, really almost panicking after Michael Penix was taken at number 8. You heard Sean Payton, or at least I heard Sean Payton during the draft in interviews afterwards saying once Penix went at number 8, everybody was kind of taken by surprise, and it threw everybody into a shock because the Broncos obviously need a quarterback. The Vikings were targeting JJ, but once one of them went earlier than they'd expect, everybody starts to hit the red button, so to say, and start trying to figure out their options to ensure that they get their guy, their number 1 prospect on their board. And I just think if the Falcons would have went defensive player first, all these other teams would have relaxed, and I think a trade with the New York Jets would have become a lot more likely because the Vikings wouldn't have felt so much pressure to move up just one more spot after the Bears selected Rome Odunze to ensure that they got J.J. McCarthy. They could have stayed at 11. You're thinking, what's the big deal? One pick. you couldn't have waited one pick to select JJ and not trade up. Well, there has been instances like Sean Payton would know. He was a pick away from selecting Patrick Mahomes. The Chiefs traded up, jumped him one pick away from him selecting Patrick Mahomes. The Chiefs jumped on top, and they ended up taking Patrick Mahomes. The rest is history. So, you could wait those extra 4 minutes, 3 minutes until you see that the pick is in at the bottom of the screen. But in that time, a trade could be worked out, and you never know what could happen. So, ironically, with the Falcons deciding to take a quarterback first, I think it just ruined their whole big plan, if this was the initial plan going into the draft, of trading back into the first round, because they threw everybody into a panic, and because of that, they weren't able to double dip, per se, in the first round and get two players, which, if they ended up getting a defensive player at 8, and then I saw that they traded back with the Jets, with the Colts, or whoever in the first round, and still got Michael Penix, instead of me coming on here and saying why I wasn't a big fan of this move, I probably would have given it, as well as other people, I'm sure, would have given their draft grade or their analysis of their draft. They probably would have been one of the best drafts, one of the best first rounds of anybody in the NFL. I truly believe that. Looking around the internet and seeing these guys evaluate the drafts, a lot of people had the Falcons last because of this questionable move. But if they would have flipped it, went defensive player first, I think everybody would have been more relaxed. They might have entertained these trade talks with the Falcons, and I'm sure a lot of people, if they drafted, say, Dallas Turner at 8 and then Michael Penix at 10, or potentially 14 or 15 if he was still there, a lot of people you would see have the Atlanta Falcons first round graded as an A, an A+. I couldn't see it anything less than that. So the way it all planned out, I just think they decided on the order of it the wrong way. I like the idea of double dipping and going for two players in there, because you address your major need, and then you get that insurance policy that I wouldn't have had any problems with if they just addressed their main need. Of course, after, in the later rounds, they, I think, had four picks in a row where they selected defensive players. So, trying to address it more so in quantity rather than quality. But I just think they got the order wrong. I like the plan. If this was the initial plan, trying to get quarterback and defensive player, I love that. But I think they got the order wrong. And because they did, it forced everybody into their shell and hide away from them trading back into the first round. And because they all wanted to get their guys, it put them all in this state of panic, not really wanting to risk too much. And the Broncos take Bo Nix. The Vikings trade up one pick and take J.J. McCarthy. And then you're left with your hands empty at the end of the day in the first round in trying to draft a defensive player. Again, it would have definitely swayed my view on this whole situation with Michael Penix and him going to the Falcons. No problem with Penix. Again, he's going to be a great player, I think. I just don't see him fitting in right away. While he's being 24 years old, I think this could have been right away a kickstart into the league, taking over a team, making it his own. He's going to have to wait a year or two with the Atlanta Falcons because I anticipate Kirk being great in the regular season. Because of that, we're not really going to see Michael Penix for a while is the anticipation as of now, and I'm kind of disappointed with that because I'm a big fan of him, but, it is what it is now. A massive what if that would have really flipped this entire draft on its head if the Falcons would have double dipped like that, but, the scenario is now what it is. The Falcons will go on with Michael Penix, and we're just going to have to see how it turns out. Definitely rooting for them, for the Falcons and Michael Penix, just because they haven't really had a lot of success recently, but they feel like this is the best route to that, and we're just going to have to take their word for it now, in all honesty. But in the meantime, we're going to move on with the show. A lot more coming up on today's episode. I mentioned the what-if scenarios. We're going to go into the second one, this time around the Houston Texans and the Cleveland Browns. Remember that trade they made with Deshaun Watson? Well, that is finally finalized, and it is the time where now the Cleveland Browns can have a first-round pick again, but we're going to analyze how each team has ended up after that trade 3 years ago. Stay tuned to find out what the Houston Texans got out of the trade and what the Cleveland Browns got as well. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break.